Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV, known as Louis the Great or the Sun King, was a monarch of the House of Bourbon who reigned as King of France from 1643 until his death in 1715. His reign of 72 years and 110 days is the longest recorded of any monarch of a country in European history. In the age of absolutism in Europe, Louis XIV's France was a leader in the growing centralization of power. Louis began his personal rule of France in 1661, after the death of his chief minister, the Italian Cardinal Mazarin, an adherent of the concept of the divine right of kings, which advocates the divine origin of monarchical rule. Louis continued his predecessors' work of creating a centralized state governed from the capital. He sought to eliminate the remnants of feudalism persisting in parts of France and, by compelling many members of the nobility to inhabit his lavish palace of Versailles, succeeded in pacifying the aristocracy, many members of which had participated in the Fronde Rebellion during Louis's minority. By these means he became one of the most powerful French monarchs, and consolidated a system of absolute monarchical rule in France that endured until the French Revolution. Louis encouraged and benefited from the work of prominent political, military, and cultural figures such as Mazarin, Colbert, Louvois, the Grand Condé, Turenne, and Bourbon, as well as Molière, Racine, Boileau, La Fontaine, Lully, Marat, Le Brun, Rigaud, Bossuet, Lavaux, Mansart, Charles and Claude Perrault, and Le Notre. Under his rule, the Edict of Nantes, which granted rights to Huguenots, was abolished. The revocation effectively forced Huguenots to emigrate or convert in a wave of dragonnades, which managed to virtually destroy the French Protestant minority. During Louis's reign, France was the leading European power, and it fought three major wars: the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and the War of the Spanish Succession. There were also two lesser conflicts, the War of Devolution and the War of the Reunions. Warfare defined Louis XIV's foreign policies, and his personality shaped his approach. Impelled by a mix of commerce, revenge, and pique, Louis sensed that warfare was the ideal way to enhance his glory. In peacetime he concentrated on preparing for the next war. He taught his diplomats that their job was to create tactical and strategic advantages for the French military. Early years. Louis XIV was born on 5 September 1638 in the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye to Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. He was named Louis Dieudonné, and bore the traditional title of French heirs apparent, Dauphin. At the time of his birth, his parents had been married for 23 years. His mother had experienced 4 stillbirths between 1619 and 1631. Leading contemporaries thus regarded him as a divine gift, and his birth a miracle of God. Sensing imminent death, Louis XIII decided to put his affairs in order in the spring of 1643, when Louis XIV was 4 years old. In defiance of custom, which would have made Queen Anne the sole regent of France, the king decreed that a regency council would rule on his son's behalf. His lack of faith in Queen Anne's political abilities was his primary rationale. He did, however, make the concession of appointing her head of the council. Louis's relationship with his mother was uncommonly affectionate for the time. Contemporaries and eyewitnesses claimed that the Queen would spend all her time with Louis. Both were greatly interested in food and theatre, and it is highly likely that Louis developed these interests through his close relationship with his mother. This long-lasting and loving relationship can be evidenced by excerpts in Louis's journal entries, such as, "Nature was responsible for the first knots which tied me to my mother, but attachments formed later, by shared qualities of the spirit are far more difficult to break than those formed merely by blood." It was his mother who gave Louis his belief in the absolute and divine power of his monarchical rule. In 1646, Nicolas V de Villeroy became the young king's tutor. Louis XIV became friends with Villeroy's young children, particularly François de Villeroy, and divided his time between the Palais Royal and the nearby Hôtel de Villeroy. Accession. On 14 May 1643, with Louis XIII dead, Queen Anne had her husband's will annulled by the Parlement de Paris. This action abolished the Regency Council and made Anne sole regent of France. Anne exiled some of her husband's ministers, and she nominated Brienne as her Minister of Foreign Affairs. She also nominated St. Vincent de Paul as her spiritual advisor, which helped her deal with religious policy and the Jansenism question. Anne kept the direction of religious policy strongly in her hand until 1661. Her most important political decisions were to nominate Cardinal Mazarin as her chief minister, and her continuation of her late husband's and Cardinal Richelieu's policy, despite their persecution of her, for the sake of her son. Anne wanted to give her son an absolute authority in a victorious kingdom. Her rationales for choosing Mazarin were mainly his ability and his total dependence on her, at least until 1653, when she was no longer regent. Anne protected Mazarin by arresting and exiling her followers who conspired against him in 1643, the Duke of Beaufort and Marie de Rohan. She left the direction of the daily administration of policy to Cardinal Mazarin. The best example of Anne's statesmanship and the partial change in her heart towards her native Spain is seen in her keeping of one of Richelieu's men, the Chancellor of France Pierre Séguier, in his post. Séguier was the person who had interrogated Anne in 1637, treating her like a common criminal, as she described her treatment following the discovery that she was giving military secrets and information to Spain. Anne was virtually under house arrest for a number of years during her husband's rule, and was physically searched and almost insulted by the Chancellor, according to certain sources. By keeping him in his post, Anne was giving a sign that the interests of France and her son Louis were the guiding spirit of all her political and legal actions. Though not necessarily opposed to Spain, she sought to end the war with a French victory, in order to establish a lasting peace between the Catholic nations. The Queen also gave a partial Catholic orientation to French foreign policy. This was felt by the Netherlands, France's Protestant ally, which negotiated a separate peace with Spain in 1648. In 1648, Anne and Mazarin successfully negotiated the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War in Germany. Its terms ensured Dutch independence from Spain, awarded some autonomy to the various German princes of the Holy Roman Empire, and granted Sweden seats on the imperial Diet and territories to control the mouths of the Oder, Elbe, and Weser rivers. France, however, profited most from the settlement. Austria, ruled by the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand III, ceded all Habsburg lands and claims in Alsace to France, and acknowledged her de facto sovereignty over the three bishoprics of Metz, Verdun, and Toul. Moreover, eager to emancipate themselves from Habsburg domination, petty German states sought French protection. This anticipated the formation of the 1658 League of the Rhine, leading to the further diminution of imperial power. Early acts. As the 30 Years' War came to an end, a civil war known as the erupted in France. It effectively checked France's ability to exploit the Peace of Westphalia. Anne and Mazarin had largely pursued the policies of Cardinal Richelieu, augmenting the crown's power at the expense of the nobility and the Anne interfered much more in internal policy than foreign affairs. She was a very proud queen who insisted on the divine rights of the King of France. All this led her to advocate a forceful policy in all matters relating to the king's authority, in a manner that was much more radical than the one proposed by Mazarin. The cardinal depended totally on Anne's support and had to use all his influence on the queen to avoid nullifying, but to restrain some of her radical actions. Anne imprisoned any aristocrat or member of parliament who challenged her will. Her main aim was to transfer to her son an absolute authority in the matters of finance and justice. One of the leaders of the Parliament of Paris, whom she had jailed, died in prison. The political heirs of the disaffected feudal aristocracy sought to protect their traditional feudal privileges from the increasingly centralized royal government. Furthermore, they believed their traditional influence and authority was being usurped by the recently ennobled bureaucrats who administered the kingdom, and on whom the monarchy increasingly began to rely. This belief intensified the nobles' resentment. In 1648, Anne and Mazarin attempted to tax members of the members refused to comply, and ordered all of the king's earlier financial edicts burned. Buoyed by the victory at the Battle of Lens, Mazarin, on Queen Anne's insistence, arrested certain members in a show of force. The most important arrest, from Anne's point of view, concerned Pierre Broussel, one of the most important leaders in the people in France were complaining about the expansion of royal authority, the high rate of taxation, and the reduction of the authority of the Parlement de Paris and other regional representative entities. Paris erupted in rioting as a result, and Anne was forced, under intense pressure, to free Broussel. Moreover, a mob of angry Parisians broke into the royal palace and demanded to see their king. Led into the royal bedchamber, they gazed upon Louis, who was feigning sleep, were appeased, and then quietly departed. The threat to the royal family prompted Anne to flee Paris with the king and his courtiers. Shortly thereafter, the conclusion of the Peace of Westphalia allowed Condé's army to return to aid Louis and his court. Condé's family was close to Anne at that time, and he agreed to help her attempt to restore the king's authority. The Queen's army, headed by Condé, attacked the rebels in Paris. The rebels were under the political control of Anne's old friend Marie de Rohan. Beaufort, who had escaped from the prison where Anne had incarcerated him 5 years before, was the military leader in Paris, under the nominal control of Conti. After a few battles, a political compromise was reached, the Peace of Rueil was signed, and the court returned to Paris. Unfortunately for Anne, her partial victory depended on Condé, who wanted to control the Queen and destroy Mazarin's influence. It was Condé's sister who pushed him to turn against the Queen. After striking a deal with her old friend Marie de Rohan, who was able to impose the nomination of as Minister of Justice, Anne arrested Condé, his brother Armand de Bourbon, Prince of Conti, and the husband of their sister Anne Geneviève de Bourbon, Duchess of Longueville. This situation did not last long, and Mazarin's unpopularity led to the creation of a coalition headed mainly by Marie de Rohan and the Duchess of Longueville. This aristocratic coalition was strong enough to liberate the princes, exile Mazarin, and impose a condition of virtual house arrest on Queen Anne. All these events were witnessed by Louis and largely explained his later distrust of Paris and the higher aristocracy. In one sense, Louis's childhood came to an end with the outbreak of the Fronde. It was not only that life became insecure and unpleasant, a fate meted out to many children in all ages, but that Louis had to be taken into the confidence of his mother and Mazarin in political and military matters of which he could have no deep understanding. The family home became at times a near prison when Paris had to be abandoned, not in carefree outings to other chateaux, but in humiliating flights. The royal family was driven out of Paris twice in this manner, and at one point Louis XIV and Anne were held under virtual arrest in the royal palace in Paris. The Frondiers planted in Louis a hatred of Paris and a consequent determination to move out of the ancient capital as soon as possible, never to return. Just as the first ended, a second one began, unlike that which preceded it. Tales of sordid intrigue and half-hearted warfare characterized this second phase of upper-class insurrection. To the aristocracy, this rebellion represented a protest against and a reversal of their political demotion from vassals to courtiers. It was headed by the highest-ranking French nobles, among them Louis's uncle Gaston, Duke of Orléans, and first cousin Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans, Duchess of Montpensier, known as princes of the blood such as Condé, his brother Armand, Prince of Conti, and their sister the Duchess of Longueville, dukes of legitimized royal descent, such as Henry, Duke of Longueville, and François, Duke of Beaufort, so-called foreign princes, such as Frédéric Maurice, Duke of Bouillon, his brother Marshal Turenne, and Marie de Rohan, Duchess of Chevreuse, and signs of France's oldest families, such as François de la Rochefoucauld. Queen Anne played the most important role in defeating the Fronde because she wanted to transfer absolute authority to her son. In addition, most of the princes refused to deal with Mazarin, who went into exile for a number of years. The claim to act on Louis's behalf, and in his real interest against his mother and Mazarin. Queen Anne had a very close relationship with the cardinal, and many observers believed that Mazarin became Louis XIV's stepfather by a secret marriage to Queen Anne. However, Louis's coming of age and subsequent coronation deprived them of the pretext for a revolt. The thus gradually lost steam, and ended in 1653, when Mazarin returned triumphantly from exile. From that time until his death, Mazarin was in charge of foreign and financial policy without the daily supervision of Anne, who was no longer regent. During this period, Louis fell in love with Mazarin's niece Marie Mancini, but Anne and Mazarin ended the king's infatuation by sending Mancini away from court to be married in Italy, while Mazarin might have been tempted for a short period of time to marry his niece to the King of France. Queen Anne was absolutely against this. She wanted to marry her son to the daughter of her brother, Philip IV of Spain, for both dynastic and political reasons. Mazarin soon supported the Queen's position, because he knew that her support for his power and his foreign policy depended on making peace with Spain from a strong position, and on the Spanish marriage. Additionally, Mazarin's relations with Marie Mancini were not good, and he did not trust her to support his position. All of Louis's tears and his supplications to his mother did not make her change her mind. The Spanish marriage was very important both for its role in ending the war between France and Spain, and because many of the claims and objectives of Louis's foreign policy in the next 50 years would be based on this marriage. Coming of age and early reforms. Louis XIV was declared to have reached the age of majority on 7 September 1651. On the death of Mazarin, in March 1661, Louis assumed personal control of the reins of government, and astonished his court by declaring that he would rule without a chief minister. Up to this moment I have been pleased to entrust the government of my affairs to the late cardinal. It is now time that I govern them myself. He was talking to the secretaries and ministers of state, will assist me with your counsels when I ask for them. I request and order you to seal no orders except by my command. I order you not to sign anything, not even a passport, without my command, to render account to me personally each day, and to favor no one. Louis was able to capitalize on the widespread public yearning for law and order that resulted from prolonged foreign wars and domestic civil strife, to further consolidate central political authority and reform, at the expense of the feudal aristocracy. Praising his ability to choose and encourage men of talent, the historian Chateaubriand noted, "It is the voice of genius of all kinds which sounds from the tomb of Louis." Louis began his personal reign with administrative and fiscal reforms. In 1661, the treasury verged on bankruptcy. To rectify the situation, Louis chose Jean-Baptiste Colbert as Controller General of Finances in 1665. However, Louis first had to neutralize Nicolas Fouquet, the Superintendent of Finances, in order to give Colbert a free hand. Although Fouquet's financial indiscretions were not very different from Mazarin's before him or Colbert's after him, his ambition was worrying to Louis. He had, for example, built an opulent chateau at Vaux-le-Vicomte where he entertained Louis and his court ostentatiously, as if he were wealthier than the king himself. The court was left with the impression that the vast sums of money needed to support his lifestyle could only have been obtained through embezzlement of government funds. Fouquet appeared eager to succeed Mazarin and Richelieu in assuming power, and he indiscreetly purchased and privately fortified the remote island of Belle-Isle. These acts sealed his doom. Fouquet was charged with embezzlement. The Parliament found him guilty and sentenced him to exile. However, Louis altered the sentence to life imprisonment and abolished Fouquet's post. With Fouquet dismissed, Colbert reduced the national debt through more efficient taxation. The principal taxes included the aides and douanes, the gabelle, and the taille. The taille was reduced at first. Financial officials were forced to keep regular accounts, auctioning certain taxes instead of selling them privately to a favored few, revising inventories and removing unauthorized exemptions. Reform proved difficult because the taille was levied by officers of the crown who had purchased their post at a high price. Punishment of abuses necessarily lowered the value of the post. Nevertheless, excellent results were achieved. The deficit of 1661 turned into a surplus in 1666. The interest on the debt was reduced from 52 million to 24 million livres. The taille was reduced to 42 million in 1661 and 35 million in 1665. Finally, the revenue from indirect taxation progressed from 26 million to 55 million. The revenues of the royal domain were raised from 80,000 livres in 1661 to 5 million livres in 1671. In 1661, the receipts were equivalent to 26 million British pounds, of which 10 million reached the treasury. The expenditure was around 18 million pounds, leaving a deficit of 8 million. In 1667, the net receipts had risen to 20 million pounds sterling, while expenditure had fallen to 11 million, leaving a surplus of 9 million pounds. To support the reorganized an enlarged army, the panoply of Versailles, and the growing civil administration. The king needed a good deal of money. Finance had always been the weak spot in the French monarchy. Methods of collecting taxes were costly and inefficient. Direct taxes passed through the hands of many intermediate officials, and indirect taxes were collected by private concessionaries, called tax farmers, who made a substantial profit. Consequently, the state always received far less than what the taxpayers actually paid. The main weakness arose from an old bargain between the French crown and nobility. The king might raise taxes without consent if only he refrained from taxing the nobles. Only the unprivileged classes paid direct taxes, and this term came to mean the peasants only, since many bourgeois in one way or another obtained exemptions. The system was outrageously unjust in throwing a heavy tax burden on the poor and helpless. Later, after 1700, the French ministers who were supported by Louis's secret wife Madame de Maintenon were able to convince the king to change his fiscal policy. Louis was willing enough to tax the nobles, but was unwilling to fall under their control, and only towards the close of his reign, under extreme stress of war, was he able, for the first time in French history, to impose direct taxes on the aristocratic elements of the population. This was a step toward equality before the law and towards sound public finance. But so many concessions and exemptions were won by nobles and bourgeois that the reform lost much of its value. Louis and Colbert also had wide-ranging plans to bolster French commerce and trade. Colbert's mercantilist administration established new industries and encouraged manufacturers and inventors, such as the Lyons silk manufacturers and the Gobelins manufactory, a producer of tapestries. He invited manufacturers and artisans from all over Europe to France, such as Murano glassmakers, Swedish iron workers, and Dutch shipbuilders. In this way, he aimed to decrease foreign imports while increasing French exports, hence reducing the net outflow of precious metals from France. Louis instituted reforms in military administration through Michel le Tellier and the latter's son François Michel le Tellier, Marquis de Louvois. They helped to curb the independent spirit of the nobility, imposing order on them at court and in the army. Gone were the days when generals protracted war at the frontiers while bickering over precedence and ignoring orders from the capital and the larger politico-diplomatic picture. The old military aristocracy ceased to have a monopoly over senior military positions and rank. Louvois, in particular, pledged to modernize the army and reorganize it into a professional, disciplined, well-trained force. He was devoted to the soldiers' material well-being and morale, and even tried to direct campaigns. Relations with the major colonies. Legal matters did not escape Louis's attention, as is reflected in the numerous great ordinances he enacted. Pre-revolutionary France was a patchwork of legal systems, with as many legal customs as there were provinces, and two coexisting legal traditions, customary law in the north and Roman civil law in the south. The Grand Ordonnance de Procédure Civile of 1667, also known as the Code Louis, was a comprehensive legal code attempting a uniform regulation of civil procedure throughout legally irregular France. Among other things, it prescribed baptismal, marriage, and death records in the state's registers, not the churches, and it strictly regulated the right of the parlements to remonstrate. The Code Louis played an important part in French legal history as the basis for the Napoleonic Code, itself derived from many modern legal codes. One of Louis's more infamous decrees was the Grande Ordonnance sur les colonies of 1685, also known as the Code Noir. Although it sanctioned slavery, it attempted to humanize the practice by prohibiting the separation of families. Additionally, in the colonies, only Roman Catholics could own slaves, and these had to be baptized. Louis ruled through a number of councils. Spain. The death of King Philip IV of Spain in 1665 precipitated the War of Devolution. In 1660, Louis had married Philip IV's eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, as one of the provisions of the 1659 Treaty of the Pyrenees. The marriage treaty specified that Maria Theresa was to renounce all claims to Spanish territory for herself and all her descendants. Mazarin and Leon, however, made the renunciation conditional on the full payment of a Spanish dowry of 500,000 écus. The dowry was never paid and would later play a part persuading Charles II of Spain to leave his empire to Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of Louis and Maria Theresa. The War of Devolution did not focus on the payment of the dowry, rather, the lack of payment was what Louis XIV used as a pretext for nullifying Maria Theresa's renunciation of her claims, allowing the land to devolve to him. In the Brabant, children of first marriages traditionally were not disadvantaged by their parents' remarriages and still inherited property. Louis's wife was Philip IV's daughter by his first marriage, while the new King of Spain, Charles II, was his son by a subsequent marriage. Thus Brabant allegedly devolved to Maria Theresa. This excuse allowed France to attack the Spanish Netherlands. Relations with the Dutch. Internal problems in the Dutch Republic aided Louis's designs. The most prominent politician in the Dutch Republic at the time, the Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt, feared the ambition of the young William III, Prince of Orange, specifically dispossession of his supreme power and the restoration of the House of Orange to the influence it had enjoyed before the death of William II, Prince of Orange. The Dutch were thus initially more preoccupied with domestic affairs than the French advance into Spanish territory. Moreover, the French were nominally their allies against the English in the ongoing Second Anglo-Dutch War. Shocked by the rapidity of French successes and fearful of the future, the Dutch decided to abandon the nominal allies and made peace with England. Joined by Sweden, the English and Dutch formed a triple alliance in 1668. The threat of an escalation of the conflict in the Low Countries and a secret treaty partitioning the Spanish succession with Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, the other major claimant to the throne of Spain, induced Louis to make peace. The Triple Alliance did not last very long. In 1670, French gold bought the adherence of Charles II of England to the secret Treaty of Dover. France and England, along with certain Rhineland princes, declared war on the Dutch Republic in 1672, igniting the Franco-Dutch War. The rapid invasion and occupation of most of the Netherlands precipitated a coup that toppled de Witt and brought William III to power. In 1674, when France lost the assistance of England, which sued for peace by the Treaty of Westminster, William III received the help of Spain, the Emperor Leopold I, and the rest of the Holy Roman Empire. Despite these diplomatic reversals, the French continued to triumph against overwhelming opposing forces. Within a few weeks, in 1674, French forces led by Louis captured all of the Spanish-held Franche-Comté. Despite being greatly outnumbered, Condé trounced William III's coalition army of Austrians. Dutchmen, and Spaniards at the Battle of Seneffe, and prevented him from descending on Paris. Another outnumbered General Turenne conducted a daring and brilliant campaign in the winter of 1674–1675 against the imperial armies under Raimondo Montecuccoli, driving them back across the Rhine River out of Alsace, which had been invaded. Through a series of feints, marches, and countermarches in 1678, Louis besieged and captured Ghent, by placing Louis in a military position far superior to his enemies. These victories brought the war to a speedy end. 6 years of war had exhausted Europe, and peace negotiations were soon concluded in 1678 with the Treaty of Nijmegen. Although Louis returned all the Dutch territory he had captured, he retained the Franche-Comté and gained more land in the Spanish Netherlands. The conclusion of a general peace permitted Louis to intervene in the Scanian War in 1679. On behalf of his ally Sweden, he forced Brandenburg Prussia to the peace table at the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and imposed peace on Denmark-Norway by the Treaty of Fontainebleau and the Peace of Lund, all concluded in 1679. The successful conclusion of the Treaty of Nijmegen enhanced French influence in Europe. But Louis was still not satisfied. In 1679, he dismissed his foreign minister Simon Arnold, Marquis de Pomponne, because he was seen as having compromised too much with the Allies. Louis maintained the strength of his army, but in his next series of territorial claims avoided using military force alone. Rather, he combined it with legal pretexts in his efforts to augment the boundaries of his kingdom. Contemporary treaties were intentionally phrased ambiguously. Louis established the Chambers of Reunion to determine the full extent of his rights and obligations under those treaties. Cities and territories, such as Luxembourg and Casale, were prized for their strategic positions on the frontier and access to important waterways. Louis also sought Strasbourg, an important strategic crossing on the left bank of the Rhine, and Nertu for a free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire, annexing it and other territories in 1681. Although part of Alsace, Strasbourg was not part of Habsburg-ruled Alsace and was thus not ceded to France in the Peace of Westphalia. Following these annexations, Spain declared war, precipitating the War of the Reunions. However, the Spanish were rapidly defeated, because the emperor abandoned them, and the Dutch only supported them minimally. By the Truce of Ratisbon in 1684, Spain was forced to acquiesce in the French occupation of most of the conquered territories, for 20 years. Louis's policy of the acute unions may have raised France to its greatest size and power during his reign, but it alienated much of Europe. This poor public opinion was compounded by French actions off the Barbary coast and at Genoa. First, Louis had Algiers and Tripoli, two Barbary pirate strongholds, bombarded to obtain a favorable treaty and the liberation of Christian slaves. Next, in 1684, a punitive mission was launched against Genoa in retaliation for its support for Spain in previous wars. Although the Genoese submitted, and the Doge led an official mission of apology to Versailles, France gained a reputation for brutality and arrogance. European apprehension at growing French might, and the realization of the extent of the Dragonade's effect led many states to abandon their alliance with France. Accordingly, by the late 1680s, France became increasingly isolated in Europe. Thank you for watching. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.